Hey everybody, welcome to the 150th supporter Q&A. I'm not sure if that's supposed to be a big milestone or anything, but I think it's pretty cool. I didn't realize that I'd been doing so many of these until you hit a bigger round number like that, and then it kind of sinks in like, wow, I've done quite a few of these, and I always enjoy them. They're always great. Some of them fly by too, because I just kind of have fun answering them and talking about these awesome different nerdy subjects. But definitely wanted to start out by saying thank you to everybody that supports and everybody that participates in these, because it's very cool that I got to 150, and let's see, hopefully things could keep going and growing and I'd be able to do 150 more of them. But anyway, let's jump in and check out the questions. Sean Kyosho Brown wants to know if the Powerbase Mini FM has been discontinued. I have excellent news for you, Sean. Castlemania Games is going to be selling those probably by the time this video goes live. I already have my post written describing exactly what this is, why you might want this one or a different version. I'm just waiting for Ryan to list them. I'll drop the links in the post and then post that on RetroRGB. So you are absolutely in luck. For anybody that doesn't know what this is, I'll give more of a detailed explanation in next week's podcast, but the basic overview is you could play Sega Master System cartridges on Sega Genesis hardware with just a pin converter, something that could interface the cartridge to the Genesis cartridge slot. Sega originally had one called the Powerbase converter that was awesome. It's this giant UFO thing that sits on top of the Genesis one. It has a Sega card slot, so you could even play the 3D games with the 3D card adapter. It's got a pause button built in. It's very cool, except for two things. Number one, it doesn't physically fit in any of the other models of Genesis. And two, it doesn't allow for any FM sound, the extra audio channel that some Master System games had built in to pass through. It doesn't have that because you actually need an FM sound chip in order to make this happen. And while I have heard of some people FM modding a Powerbase converter, those are rare and expensive, and there's no need to do it because now there are two choices. Originally designed by Renee from DB Electronics, now they're going to be sold by Castlemania, but one is the Powerbase Mini, which essentially looks like a Game Genie, but you plug Master System games on top, not other Genesis games, and it doesn't have cheats. I just use the Game Genie reference just for a visualization of what it might look like. And the Powerbase Mini FM is the same exact look, but with an FM sound chip in. So essentially, this is one of the only plug-and-play ways to get original Master System games on original hardware with FM sound channels. So I'll go into more detail next week, but that was the basic overview. And yeah, hopefully by the time this goes live, or at the very least goes public, those will be up for sale. Alan Bingham says they're really interested in investing in a MiSTer exclusively for arcade games. However, the games they're most interested in are the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade game and its follow-up Turtles in Time. As far as I could tell, I don't think those games are supported on MiSTer yet, but I'm not sure. I really don't want to financially dive into this until I know 100% that the games I want most are supported. Don't know if there's a specific comprehensive list of all the cores, but it would be nice to bookmark a page like that. So the GitHub should have all of the core information. There are not Turtles games available, but if you want the widest variety of arcade games, especially in an actual arcade cabinet, the RGB Pi JAMA and a good Raspberry Pi setup should be very, very good for arcade games, especially for beat-em-ups where lag is definitely noticeable, but it's not going to be as crazy noticeable as fighting games or platformers where you have to time your jumps perfectly. Now, I'm not an expert on beat-em-ups, but in the experience that I do have, I do notice lag when it's too much, but when it's just a little bit, it's not something that really ruins the experience for me. That's not a fact, though. That's just my opinion. So I would say if you're really worried about newer cores getting added and what you really want is the widest variety of arcade games, I would do a Raspberry Pi and a RGB Pi JAMA and stick that right in your arcade machine. And the only thing you might have to adjust is buttons for six button games, but that's pretty much it. So no disrespect to MiSTer. I obviously love that project, but if your goal is to play the widest variety of games games or specific games that aren't supported yet, I would definitely go Raspberry Pi or PC or anything else, of course, as well. But I would kind of go down that route now and then revisit Myster in a bit. But I do recommend checking out the live stream I did where I played console games in an arcade environment via the Mystercade, and it really did kind of change the feel for me. And not only that, in the Mystercade video that I posted, one of the points that I made was that there's a bunch of arcade ports on home consoles that are absolutely good enough for me for now. It didn't line up with the exact timing of the video when I shot it, but a perfect example is Arcade TV. Alex just posted an MSU MD hack for Afterburner that includes the arcade soundtrack on the Genesis version. So I have absolutely been firing up my Mystercade and playing a couple rounds of Afterburner whenever I just need to kill some time, and it's absolutely good enough to keep me to hold me over until somebody eventually gets to the Afterburner core. But that's totally your decision to make. So I would kind of think of it from that point of view and then go from there. But if it's a wide variety of games you're looking for, you can't really go wrong with the Raspberry Pi because you could have every game almost. Couple of questions from Goodnight. First, they recently got a Dell VGA CRT monitor that supports up to 1600 by 1200 at 65 Hz, but when they're using the OSSC Line 5X mode in 1600 by 1200 mode, it doesn't work. The monitor just displays black, and it doesn't give a no signal screen as normal, but it works fine on the other modes. So far, just stretching Line 2X to fit the screen has worked perfectly fine. Just curious as to why Line 5X wouldn't work. So I have two answers to that. First, it wouldn't work it may not work just because the signals don't match up exactly to what a PC monitor would be expecting. And especially when you have VGA CRT monitors, once you get past, 640 by 480, 800 by 600, and the lower ones, the higher resolutions weren't so popular to be supported back then. So I have run into issues where on a wide variety of VGA monitors actually, but VGA CRT monitors, that it gets a little weirder as you get up to the higher resolutions. But my kind of strong opinion on this is to, in that environment, follow the video I did about classic consoles on VGA monitors, put it in Line 2X mode, throw on scan lines, and you have yourself a really close comparable experience that a RGB monitor would be, to the point where, if for whatever reason I lost all my monitors and just had one really nice 20-inch VGA monitor, I would be completely fine playing it that way. It would be really hard to notice differences. You'd have to be somebody that worked with the video signals to do things like make videos or do comparison videos in order to really see the differences. So if you have the ability to do Line 2X with optimal timings, great. Just Line 2X generic is also good too. But I would really stick with it that way, and just remember to put scan lines on 100%, and check out that video I did if you hadn't seen it, because it should line up pretty well, and you should have a really awesome retro experience that's zero lag. Your next question is any tips for keeping your VGA CRT in good shape? Screen's in great shape. I've wiped the whole thing down with a damp cloth, got a proper power supply, sprayed what I could with canned air, and keep it powered off as much as possible. Anything I should look at or consider having done, like cap replacements? If it's in good condition and it's working well, I personally would leave well enough alone, with one exception. Shine a flashlight and look in through the vent holes. If you're comfortable, maybe unbolt the case and just pull the plastic back a little bit and look in, but see if you could see any signs of leaking capacitors. And if they're leaking, I would absolutely look into getting it done, especially because it seems like it's a good monitor that you like. If it's not leaking and everything's working and the geometry isn't all crazy, I would probably just keep using it, and just keep in the back of your mind that at some point some maintenance is going to have to be done on it, but you could have quite a few more years before any of that's required. So I would just kind of go from there. If you're somebody that already does cap replacements, just think about it, and when you have time to do it, look into discharging the CRT properly and making a cap list and all that stuff. But if it's working all right, I think you should be fine. Robert Dickinson is looking to take a Naomi arcade platform and integrate it into a 15 kilohertz arcade machine setup. And this is going to be an interesting thing to do because the Naomi was released around the time of the Dreamcast, and it is its arcade counterpart. So it's a predominantly 480p outputting machine. And I do believe it has a 15 kilohertz switch, but I think that means anything would output 480i. So I'm not 100% sure on that, by the way. There could be 240p output instead. You would want to check into that. The only experience I have with Naomi is going into a really nice VGA monitor, so I never messed with it anything other than 480p 31 kilohertz. But the two issues that Robert's going to run into is this. First, it looks like they're able to interface that VGA output through something called a Capcom I/O for JAMA, which I've heard the term Capcom I/O a couple of times before, so I'm not really sure which board you're referring to. And you're going to need to know what that board does. Does it simply just change the pins from VGA to JAMA and then integrate the controls as well? Or does it do any kind of signal changing at all? Also, you're going to want to look at what the output is of the Naomi and if it could go directly into a GBS control. You're going to want to just double check voltages and see if anybody else has done that, because just in case that the Naomi does only output either 480i or 480p, you could set it to 480p, run it through the GBS control, and downscale that to 240p, which should look really good. It'll be inexpensive, and it'll be about half a frame of lag, so absolutely 99.999% chance you will never notice any lag at all or have any kind of lesser experience as a result. It's definitely something you could use with confidence. So if that's the case, let's just say hypothetically you could plug the Naomi directly into the GBS control. What happens on the output of the GBS control? Do you need to then change that signal, or would that go directly into the Capcom I/O? And those are things that I have no direct experience with, so I'm not comfortable giving you the answers, but hopefully I was able to at least present the right questions so that you could figure this out and kind of piece this together safely. And please let me know, because I would certainly love confirmation on, does Naomi only output 480i in 15 kilohertz mode? And can a GBS control setup accept that signal directly? And what is the Capcom I/O, or at least which Capcom I/O am I thinking of here that you're talking about? And how does that integrate it? But that's a pretty cool idea. I just would love to know the specifics of all of that. Scanline City wants to know, Groovy MAME versus Raspberry Pi JAMA, benefits versus drawbacks. So that's an interesting one, and this is mostly about ease of use and functionality and less about everything else around it. But Raspberry Pi JAMA, you get something like an RGB Pi JAMA, you plug it into a Raspberry Pi 3B, you load their software package, you load your games, and you plug it into an arcade machine, and you're done. You might have to plug in a keyboard once to configure the main controls, and then that's it. It's not going to be the fastest solution, but it'll just work. And it's easy, and it's small, and it's relatively cheap compared to other potential options. So it's very easy to get involved in that, and there's a lot of people using that exact same setup. So if you run into issues, support is generally easier because, you just pick whatever Raspberry Pi hat you're using and whatever software you're using, and you talk to other people that are doing the same. Now, on the flip side, you could use Groovy MAME on any PC, which means if you'd like, you could use a very fast CPU to run the MAME cores and get really good emulation of arcade games. Very fast, very low lag. And in order to get them to JAMA, you could do something like use an arcade VGA video card and then use a JPAC. I think it's a JPAC. I forgot exactly which is the one I used to have, but basically it takes VGA and changes it to JAMA, and also has keyboard and USB inputs so that you could map the controls on your arcade machine to buttons on a keyboard. So it essentially works in a very low latency mode in order to do all that. So overall, you could essentially take like your last gen PC, if you build your own PCs and stuff, pull out the video card or try to have some kind of conversion, maybe a downscaler like the GBS control, run it through one of these and have a really, really fast machine. But for the most part, you're on your own. And people that use Groovy MAME get upset when I say that. But the honest truth is you're working on a lot of stuff that's completely specific to you. What's the PC you're using? What's the video card in that? Can you set that video card to 640 by 480 and then run it through a downscaler and guarantee that it always is going to stay that way? Would you rather use an arcade VGA that you could set to 15 kilohertz at all times? Which JPAC are you using? And my apologies if I'm using the wrong term. I could swear it was a JPAC that I used to use on mine, but the device that integrates VGA to JAMA as well as controls to JAMA, is that working properly? Do you need to manually wire in extra buttons from your arcade machine if you're using buttons 5 and 6? So while all of those things are very easily solvable from people who have done it before, that's not as mainstream these days as just throwing a Raspberry Pi solution in it. So if you're a tinkerer, you don't mind spending the time to do all this, you have an extra PC laying around, then using that would be an awesome solution that I would definitely recommend. But if you don't have any of that stuff, or you just want a small little dedicated box to do this, Raspberry Pi with an RGB Pi JAMA is definitely an easier way to go about doing it. Bradley says, this may be the most important candy-related question in retro gaming. Do you prefer the Fireball from Console 5 or the gummies from Laser Bear? Well, I think both are awesome, and I think that it's really fun and cool that both have their signature calling card with their shipments. However, I swear I did not change this for your question. I am currently wearing my Laser Bear shirt right now, and this is the shirt with lasers coming out of the bear's eyes. Trying to get that on camera. Yeah, so I'm always partial to anything bear related. So Greg from Laser Bear is going to get my win on this one, but that's just my own bias. However, two very important things. I love them both. I think they're awesome. And Jose never gets them because whenever we do bulk orders, I'll always text him and say, hey, I'm getting stuff from Console 5 and you need any cap kits. That'll arrive. I'll separate. All right, that's the stuff Jose needed. That's the stuff I needed. And I eat both of the Fireballs. So, yeah, I like them both. I think they're both great ideas. I'm a little more partial to bears, but poor Jose never gets any of them because my fat ass eats them either way. Jordan Chaston said, on the write-up I did about the RGB and LCD driver, I linked to the Japanese website where they're sold, and I also linked to a compatible screen from the same place. But the screen is 4 inches, while all the Nomad brackets I've ever seen say they are for 3.5-inch screens. Are they compatible? Also, is this screen IPS? If no for either of these, do you know where I could buy or import a quality screen that works with the RGB driver? No to all. Sorry, Jordan, I know that's the most useless question, but they've changed a lot of stuff about this. And I'm not an expert in installing these, and I always have a really hard time following which one to get. And they're not very friendly. They don't really help you on that Japanese website, and you can't order directly from them. You need to order from those other companies that purchase local in Japan and then ship. So I really, not only am I completely useless to you, I don't know anywhere you can go to get the exact right answer. You might want to look into any other companies that carry them, even people that just buy them directly from them and resell them elsewhere and see if they have any suggestions. I've also heard there's multiple versions now of the RGB driver, and there might be different screens that could be compatible with each. So this is definitely not my level of expertise, and it changes quite often. So if anybody has any solid info where they could also post links to proof, not just, oh, I heard from a person who knows a person that says this, I would certainly love to get facts about this. But I think the unfortunate truth is we just need a company that cares more about supporting the retro gaming industry and posts all of this info and is willing to ship worldwide. It's a really mean thing to say, but it's just the truth. It's the fact is that there's, a small group that are kind of hoarding these things to themselves, whereas everybody that has a Nomad wants at least more info on this stuff. So hopefully that'll get out there. Retro Gaming Boombox is having trouble running dual output from their Mistress setup. They have an I/O board and obviously the HDMI output built into the DE10, but every time they flip the switch in order to enable component video output from the I/O board, their HDMI output stops working. And that's never happened to me before, and I've definitely tested this setup. So my gut's telling me that your first troubleshooting step would be to take the original Mr. INI file and rename it INI_original file or something like that, and then download the latest version of that INI file right from their GitHub, or copy and paste it into a text file, whatever. But basically get the latest version of the INI file, set that one flag, set the resolution of the HDMI output to whatever it is that you prefer, and try that. I think my gut's telling me that something is messed up in the INI file that's causing it to happen. There could be a duplicate of something, could be a million things in there, which is why just, saving the original just in case, but trying a new one is probably the best first troubleshooting step. So I would absolutely give that a shot and see what happens, and you should be fine afterwards. But if not, then I would probably look into, where did you get the IO board? Is there something physical that's happening with that? But I mean, they don't really intersect at all. So I'm kind of curious to see what happens. So please, if you wouldn't mind posting back and letting me know your results. Justin has a pretty interesting issue with their Super Nintendo. It's not a one chip, it's one of the earlier models of it, and it doesn't work with an S-video cable. They don't get any signal. And on top of that, while RGB works when using a CSync cable, RGB won't sync if they use a Sync on Luma cable. The issue is with their childhood console, and they've had the issue for over 5 years now. So that's a pretty interesting one. That sounds like there's a problem with the components in the S-video line of that, but I'm wondering what the problem might be. And capacitors are always the first thing that pop into mind, because I have seen Super Nintendos with aging and sometimes even lightly leaking capacitors, not nearly as bad as like the Duo systems, but still leaking, which means still dangerous. So the first thing I would absolutely do is pop that open and see if you see leakage. And if you do at all, and I mean, sometimes if you're not eagle-eyed with this stuff, leftover flux from the factory might kind of look like leakage. You know what? If that's the case, just wipe it down with a Q-tip and some isopropyl. And if it wipes right off super easy, then it could be safe. But to me, that sounds like a perfect excuse to replace the capacitors. And that's something that, as long as you don't do any damage while you replace them, it's still a stock console. You're not modding your console. You're not changing it. You're just making sure to do the correct preventative maintenance. And I only mention that because you said it's your childhood system, and you've been the only owner of it. So I just want you to feel like this is still going to be your childhood system. It's just going to be, it's like doing an oil change in a car. It's not making it, if you do that on a classic car, it's not making it not classic anymore because your oil was made in the past couple of years. So it's just good maintenance on it. So that's absolutely something I would check it out and see if that's the problem. And the good news is, if it's not the problem with it, you just did preventative maintenance that you'll probably never have to do again. So that's definitely a safe first step, even if it's not the issue. But if you do it that way, you could then try to troubleshoot other things and figure out what the issue is. A few things from Focus. First, they wanted to follow up and say that they got the Audio Authority component distribution amp for component video for splitting the output to multiple consumer-grade TVs. And it seems to be working great, except one of their CRTs is fuzzier than the other, which is kind of typical on aging CRTs, but try messing with settings, see if there's a service mode or anything that you could do, but that's kind of typical. And also, if it's a bigger TV, it's not going to be as sharp, but either way, it's always good to hear that stuff's working and you have some cool CRTs to use. Actual question though, is it okay to leave the component video amp powered on basically forever? I'd love to plug this in and simply forget about it. Do you think this could cause issues? It is my guess. I want to make sure that I'm guessing here. It is my guess that it is absolutely perfectly fine to do all of that. It is my OCD preference to have a full setup like that with some kind of kill switch, even if it's just a circuit and a circuit breaker, so that I only power it on when I use it. But if you use it every day, or if that's a pain to do, I completely understand why you wouldn't want to do that. But there's no specific reason for me saying that. It's not like I'm saying that as a result of a problem I had when leaving an audio amp on 24/7. That's just my general caution as a nerd to do that stuff. But the actual answer to your question is it's probably safe to leave on 24/7 forever, and you won't have any issues with it at all. So I'd be fine with it, but if you have a way to build some kind of kill switch into the whole thing, I would absolutely do that as well. Just because why not, right? Rick Lewis just watched the newest Analog Frontiers episode, and it made them curious. What could the average collector, someone who has a large collection but nothing super rare, to do to help with game preservation? Should we catalog all our games and dump all the ROMs just in case there's something unique? Or is there somewhere on the internet to see things that are sought after? Just curious if there was any way normal collectors could help the community. That's a really interesting question, and I'm gonna give some basic suggestions, but depending on which you choose or which is the most appealing, I would definitely research each one of these deeper just to see. The first thing I would say is, as cheesy as this sounds, it is the truth in that if you really want to support a lot of these preservation efforts, you're going to have to support the people that are really spending a giant chunk of their time doing it. And, I always recommend people looking for Patreons or way to support in any way. Or if you don't have the ability to, just retweet them and spread the word. Very often that's good enough to help, because people who might be in the position to help do once they realize that, hey, this thing exists that I didn't even know existed. So that's always the first thing I suggest. And it sounds like pandering, but it is the honest truth. The other thing, too, is just take a basic look at your stuff. Do you have Super Mario 1, 2, and 3 and, Zelda for Super Nintendo or something like that? And if that's the case, the chances of you having something rare that no one else has ever seen before is pretty slim. If you would like to, you could dump the ROMs and make sure that, just to double check, I have revision 1.3, and yes, there's a million of them out there, but at least I know exactly which one I have. That's absolutely something you could do. And if that's your style of nerding, then absolutely go for it. But I would also take a look and see, hey, what do I have that looks different? I've seen pictures of Metroid everywhere, and it looks like this, but my copy looks like this. It's different. Why? And there are actually a couple of versions of Metroid out there. Most of them I think are just box and cartridge differences, but there's definitely different stuff out there. So I would definitely pay attention to that and see if there's visually anything that stands out, and check those. And you could also check things like any of the preservationist websites, or even just download one of the Smoke Monster scripts and read through it to see which games that are already in it and what it's looking for, or just search through and reference, hey, or any of the redumps for CDs or any of the main packs that they have out there. Just download something and do a search in the file folder and see if you have something they don't. That's always another good reason. And of course, any kind of prototypes, demos, or betas, those are almost always guaranteed to be worth looking at. Even if people say, we already have 10 different betas of Sonic, so we're probably not going to need yours. Check it anyway, though, because you never know. Maybe you're going to get the earliest one or the latest one, or maybe you'll have a different part of a level. There's no way to tell unless you check. So I would absolutely go through all of that. I do wonder if there's one repository that's just, here's a list of every game ever, here's of all of the versions of the game. And if there's nothing like that out there, I'd love to work with people to try to get that out there. But that's a giant undertaking, and I already work way too much than I should. So, if anybody else out there wants to help with that, or if there already exists, definitely let me know. But those are probably good things I could point you in the right direction of. And if anybody else has any other ideas, feel free to post about that as well. Juan Franciscorocco said, when connecting a VGA output from Mr. Raspberry Pi or a PC to an arcade CGA monitor, besides combining the sync signals, do I have to do something to the RGB signals levels? I connected them directly and it seems to work, but I'm not sure what is the right way. Sync is usually the biggest thing that you'll run into with stuff like that, but I would just double check voltages. Does your monitor accept whatever range of voltages you're sending to it? When you combine sync, is that sending too much voltage? Are you using a passive sync combiner, an active sync combiner? I would basically just check that. And as an example, many Sony PVMs, if not all of them, but many of the more modern ones, the ones that you see the most often, can accept a super wide range of voltages. So plugging it in the lowest level sync from a console that's at 200 millivolts versus plugging in TTL level sync could potentially be fine depending on the monitor. You always want to check the specs, the service manuals, whatever data you can get on it, but it should be okay. I would just always recommend double checking just in case, only for the reason of if something goes wrong, it's harder to fix. If it was a brand new monitor and you were talking about an HDMI connection, I'd say plug it in. If an HDMI connection breaks it, call the manufacturer and make them fix it. That's a defect. But analog video is weirder than that. And even if it did still fall under that category, it's tougher to get things fixed than newer equipment, and heavier. It's way harder to throw a CRT in a box and ship it out to be repaired than a flat panel. So I would just double check it, but it sounds like you should be fine. Outers Evan wants to know if a Terra Onion Super SD System 3 could work with Sega Genesis HD Retrovision cables. I happen to have one right here, and it worked perfect. I had heard people talk about having issues with it, but maybe it was with the original first run of SSDS3s, but I got it right here, and this is an unmodded one. This isn't one with any hacks done to it. This is just a standard SSDS3. And seemed to work perfect. So I would say that's a definite yes. And if there is an issue, it would be with whatever individual one that you have, not as a whole. So seems like a safe bet. Jason Guffey had a couple of questions. First, they want to know if it's necessary to use good quality shielded cables for 100% of a signal's path or only a certain part of it. And the answer to that, no doubt, is 100% of the path. And you could often see this in people who have fully shielded cables that they bought for their consoles that are expensive, and they go into a good piece of equipment like a G-SCART switch or an Extron Crosspoint, and then they use crappy RCA cables that they found lying around that probably came with a VCR a million years ago to interface from that into a scaler or an RGB monitor, and the signal just drops totally. That's also the case with certain model bandridge switches where if you use composite video as sync, everything, you get shielded cables, so it doesn't matter. There's no checkerboarding effect if you plug it directly into your scaler, but you plug it through that and the interference skips across the board. So 100% of the signal's path, definitely. And if you're picking up RCA branded cables at a local place, unfortunately, it's the same problem that you get from buying them anywhere, Amazon, whatever else, and a problem that I run into all the time, and that you might not have a thick shielded cable. You might just have a cable with a lot of foam around it, essentially. And the only real way to know is to cut it open, which sucks because I hate wasting stuff. But I talked about that with a Mr. setup for the past few weeks where I couldn't figure out why this one configuration always looked like crap. I was using these nice, big, thick, heavy cables. And finally, I was at wit's end. I cut the end off one of the cables and saw that not only was there zero shielding, but they were using the thinnest wire gauge possible. So the cables probably would have broke within a few weeks of unplugging and replugging anyway, because the actual wire inside was so thin. So it stinks because there's no easy way to test. I guess you could probably test with an oscilloscope. You could probably test putting patterns through, but the only true way to know how shielded the cable is and how thick it is to buy one, cut it open. If it's good, save that for something else or repair it, and then buy more of that exact same type. Speaking of cables, if you're using CSync on an Extron Crosspoint, where would the sync plug into? Because the Crosspoints have RGB HV, not a dedicated sync output. I always use CSync on the horizontal sync connection of all of these things. It's never seemed to be a problem, but if anybody has any info on why that wouldn't work, let me know. But I've always just run CSync over H on all of the devices that I've used for that. They also had a question about scalers. If you send a scaler that's outputting 1080p, a 1080p signal, is it pass-through, or is there still some kind of processing applied? And it's my experience, obviously I haven't tested every single scaler out there, but it's my experience that unless there's specifically a pass-through mode that you could enable, something's being done to it. There are some exceptions in which if they automatically detect that resolution, it automatically switches to some kind of pass-through mode. But just because there's processing being done to it doesn't really mean anything bad necessarily. So I wouldn't worry about it so much, especially if you're running it through a device like an iScan VP50. I think that's got about half a frame of lag. So if your choice was to every time you played something in 1080p to dig deep into the menus and go through and set something into pass-through mode, basically anything that wasn't a one-button push, I wouldn't bother. I don't really think half a frame of lag would matter to me, and I'm really sensitive to lag, so that's just some perspective. But I'm not sure if there was another specific reason about that. Lastly, you had a question about the GBS 8200 board. You were wondering about dual output. So the 8200s only support one output at a time, period. And this is the 8220s support two outputs. And I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but here's my old hacked up GBS all-in-one. And this is, where's my finger? So this used to be a VGA port, but I wanted to dedicate this output to go to the HDMI. So I actually desoldered that, and I'm using the connector behind it to run to that. On your original GBS 8200, not the dual outputs, you might still have a VGA and another connector, but you could only use one at a time, or it's the same thing as using a Y cable. It's not good for it. So that's specifically why I'm using this one, is because I figured I would use this for the scenarios in which I definitely need two outputs at the same time. And it's been coming in handy for testing, but I'm not sure if your average person would need that, especially when you could just use HDMI splitters, VGA splitters, whatever else. But yeah, I just wanted to make sure everybody knows, just because even if your 8200 looks the same as this one and has a VGA and a connector, that's not dual output. That's one or the other. So hopefully that kind of puts everything into perspective. Well, that's it for this week. If you're new to these Q&As, ask any question you have wherever the latest Q&A post is, wherever it is that you support. The way the services work, I can't really go through and figure out who asked what question where. And to be honest, it's a lot more fun to just click on the latest post and scroll through and read all the answers like that. So any question you got, fire away wherever it is that you support. And of course, thank you to everybody that participates in these and everybody that supports in any way, because without your support, none of these videos, the behind the scenes research, the weekly podcast, the website, none of that would exist without you. So thank you all so much, and I'll see you next week.